I need you to understand something before I begin. I am not a dramatic person. I have never been dramatic. I'm 40 years old and I've spent the better part of my adult life being the woman who keeps it together, the one who processes quietly, who cries in the car and then fixes her mascara before walking into wherever she needs to be, who turns pain into productivity because that's just what you do. I'm an editor at a mid-size publishing house. I read manuscripts for a living. I know how stories work. I know how they're supposed to go. This one surprised me. His name was Daniel Ashford. He was 51, a structural engineer with a firm in the city, the kind of man whose handshake made other men feel evaluated. He had grey at his temples and a laugh that arrived fully formed, not built, not performed, just released, like he'd been holding it loosely and simply let go. When I met him at a colleague's dinner party 6 years ago, I thought, this is a man who knows who he is. This is a man who will not waste my time. I was 34, recently out of a long relationship that had fizzled into comfortable nothingness rather than ended with any real conviction. I was open. I was ready for something that felt like it had weight to it. Daniel had weight. He called me 3 days after that dinner party, which felt exactly right, not desperate, not dismissive. He said, I've been thinking about what you said about Toni Morrison, and I think you're right about the way silence functions in her work, and I'd like to talk about it over dinner if you're willing. That was the sentence. That was the sentence that opened the door to 6 years of my life. We dated, we fell in love, or I fell in love, and he demonstrated all the appropriate responses to love. We moved into a rhythm that felt from the inside like something rare and constructed with care. He remembered things. He brought me coffee exactly the way I liked it, 2 sugars, a splash of oat milk without being asked after the 3rd date. He texted good morning and good night, and in between, and the texts were specific, not generic. Thinking about you and that story you told about your grandmother's garden, not hey. He seemed interested in the texture of me, the specific details, not just the general shape of a girlfriend. And he loved the way I looked. He told me often, not in an uncomfortable, objectifying way, in a thoughtful way. He'd tuck a strand of hair behind my ear and say, I love your hair like this, with such sincerity that it felt like an observation rather than a compliment. He'd notice when I wore the green dress and his face would do something that felt like recognition, like relief, like I had arrived somewhere he had been waiting. I loved being loved that specifically. I loved it so much that I didn't notice for years that I was being loved with a precision that should have made me curious. I should describe myself before I go further because it matters. Not vanity, context. I'm what some people call naturally brunette, which means my hair falls about 3 inches past my shoulders in a shade my mother always called chestnut, though I've heard it described as every variation of brown that English offers. I have hazel eyes that go green in certain lights, olivish skin that tans easily, and the kind of bone structure that my aunts call strong-featured, which I've come to understand means handsome more than pretty. I am 5'6". I was, at 34, a size 8. I kept my hair straight, or mostly straight, because I'd always worn it that way. I wore silver jewelry. I've always worn silver jewelry since college because gold felt wrong against my complexion. I tended toward jewel tones, emerald, burgundy, cobalt, and natural fabrics, and mid-century furniture, and folk music, and cooking from scratch, and long walks, and books about memory and identity, and the way time bends inside the mind. These were mine, these were just mine, or so I believed. The first 2 years with Daniel were easy in a way that felt like luck. We travelled well together. He liked the same kind of travel I liked, unhurried, eating where locals ate, wandering without itineraries, spending whole afternoons in a single neighbourhood trying to understand how people actually lived there. We'd been to the coast of Portugal, to a small town in the mountains of Colorado where a friend of his had a cabin, to New Orleans twice. We cooked together. We read in the same room. We argued about things that could be argued about without anyone getting hurt. Politics, film, the best way to make a bechamel. I told my best friend, Cora, that I thought I'd finally found what I'd been looking for. She was sitting across from me at the Indian place on 9th Street that we'd been going to for 12 years, and she was looking at me with the expression she sometimes wore that I couldn't quite read. Not concern exactly, something more like study. He sounds perfect, she said, and something in the word perfect made me want to defend him, which was its own interesting instinct. He's not perfect, I said. He's private, he doesn't talk about his ex-wife much. Which is fine, Cora said. Which is fine, I agreed. His ex-wife was named Vivian. That's all I knew for the first 2 years, and even that felt like information he'd shared reluctantly in a late-night conversation during our second month of dating when I'd asked directly about his romantic history. He'd been married for 8 years in his 30s. It ended 6 years before we met. He said they had grown apart. He said it with the practiced neutrality of someone who had told that story many times and had sanded down all the rough edges. I didn't push. I figured everyone was allowed their private grief, their sealed rooms. The only thing he said about Vivian that lodged in me strangely was this: she was extraordinary. I don't think I fully understood that until after. He said it the way you say something that you've been carrying alone for a long time. And then he moved on, and I let him, because what do you do with that kind of sentence? You absorb it and you continue, because the alternative is to ask questions whose answers might be things you don't want. The subtle things didn't register as a pattern for a long time. That's the nature of subtle things. They're designed to be absorbed individually rather than understood collectively. You have to arrange them side by side before they start to form something readable. And Daniel never gave me a reason to arrange them. He mentioned early on that he loved my hair down rather than up. I wore it down more. That seems unremarkable, right? A man says he loves your hair a certain way, you wear it that way because you love him. That's not control, that's consideration. That's the small calibrations of intimacy. Except, about 18 months in, I went through a phase where I was considering cutting my hair. I'd been growing it out since college essentially, and I was 40, and I wanted something different, something angular and modern. I brought it up one evening lightly, the way you mentioned something you haven't fully decided, and Daniel went still, just slightly still, the way a room goes still when a window closes and all the air rearranges. I like it long, he said. I know, I said, I just thought maybe a change. He looked at me for a moment that was a beat longer than it needed to be, and then he smiled and said, You can obviously do whatever you want. I just think it's beautiful the way it is. I'd miss it. He said I'd miss it in a way that made me feel like cutting my hair would be a small loss he'd carry quietly. And I'm not proud of this, but I didn't cut it. I told myself I wasn't ready. I told myself it wasn't the right time. I kept it long. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand how these things work. They don't feel like control. They feel like love. They feel like someone knowing you well enough to have preferences about you, and that feeling of being known, of being specifically loved rather than generically loved, is so seductive that it's almost impossible to interrogate while you're inside it. The jewelry thing happened differently. I mentioned once in passing that I'd been looking at some vintage pieces online, some gold earrings with a geometric Art Deco feel, and Daniel sort of tilted his head and said, I don't know, I think gold can look a little harsh against cool-toned skin. I have olive skin. It's not particularly cool-toned, but I nodded and I moved on and I didn't buy the earrings. And later he bought me silver earrings, long, delicate ones, and said they were beautiful on me, and they were, and I wore them constantly, and I stopped looking at gold. The green dress thing. I had several dresses he particularly loved, and they were all jewel tones, mostly green and burgundy. Every time I wore them he lit up, and when I wore other colors, a yellow sundress I'd bought before we met, a pale pink blouse, his response was pleasant, but somehow the specific warmth wasn't there. I noticed. I told myself I was imagining things. I started reaching more often for the colors that got the response because I am human, because positive feedback creates behavioral patterns, because love is, among other things, a very effective conditioning mechanism. The interest convergence was the strangest thing, and the one I was least able to see clearly because it happened the most slowly. Over the 6 years, my interest in folk music deepened, or what I thought was deepening, because Daniel loved folk music and we went to concerts, and I genuinely came to love it too. But the music I had loved before Daniel, indie pop, some hip-hop, the kind of alternative stuff you listen to in your 20s, slowly receded from my playlists. Not because he criticized it, because I was playing what we listened to together, and we listened to folk, and my identity as a person who loved folk music solidified while my earlier tastes blurred. The cooking thing, the long walks, the mid-century furniture that now filled our shared apartment. Daniel had moved in after 4 years, and he'd brought his aesthetic with him, and when we furnished together, we went toward what he loved most, and I loved it too, and I couldn't have told you then whether I had always loved it or whether I'd grown into loving it through proximity to him. Here's what I know now. Some of those things were already mine before I met him. Some of them grew genuinely through our relationship, and some of them I genuinely cannot say. I can't separate them anymore. That's the worst part, not knowing which parts of yourself were assembled by someone else's hand. The proposal happened on a Tuesday. Not a special Tuesday, a completely regular Tuesday in February of last year, which meant we'd been together 5 years almost exactly. We were making dinner, lamb chops and roasted vegetables, and he'd been in the kitchen with me, and then he set down the wooden spoon and he turned to me and he said, "I want to spend the rest of my life making dinner with you." I knew what it was before he said it. The ring was already in his hand, a silver band with an oval emerald, my stone, my colour, silver because I wore silver always, and I said yes before he finished the question, and I held his face in my hands afterward, and I was crying and he wasn't, but his eyes were doing the thing they did, that complicated something that I'd always interpreted as depth of feeling. We got engaged. We told everyone. My parents liked Daniel but had always maintained the careful, polite distance of people who hoped their daughter would be happy without fully extending faith. Cora said, "Congratulations, Kents," and hugged me hard and then pulled back and looked at me with that look again. My coworker Renata brought champagne to the office. Daniel and I set a date, November of this year, 9 months away. We hired a wedding planner named Bryn, who I'll come back to later, because Bryn, without meaning to, became one of the first threads I pulled. But before Bryn, before any of that, there was the party. It was March, 8 months ago from now as I sit here writing this. A colleague of Daniel's, a senior partner at his firm named Greg Harverson, threw a birthday party for his wife at their home in the suburbs, the kind of home that announces success at every turn. Cathedral ceilings, a caterer, an entire room devoted to a bar. Daniel and I had been to Greg and Nancy's parties before. They were the pleasant, exhausting kind of social events that are required when your partner has a career, where you make conversation with people whose names you half know and smile, until your face does it on its own. Daniel had been quiet on the drive over. Not unusually quiet, he had quiet moods that I'd come to understand as separate from any feeling about me, just a retreat into internal space that he needed sometimes. I hadn't questioned it. I'd played music and watched the highway and thought about a manuscript I was editing at work. At the party, we separated as couples do, orbiting each other while doing the social rounds. I talked to Nancy, who I liked, and to a woman named Patricia, who was a landscape architect and had interesting things to say about how people use outdoor space. I had a glass of white wine and then most of a second. I was fine. I was present. I was being a good fiancé at a work event. And then Daniel appeared at my elbow. I remember the exact quality of the moment. He put his hand on the small of my back. He always put his hand on the small of my back. That was his default greeting when he rejoined me in social situations. And he said, low and close to my ear, "There's someone I'd like to introduce you to." I turned, expecting another engineer, another spouse, another person whose name I'd remember for approximately 40 minutes. The woman standing in front of us was about my height. Her hair fell to just below her shoulders, chestnut brown, straight or mostly straight, the kind of hair that exists in the space between styled and natural. She wore a deep green dress the shade of old money or old forests. She had hazel eyes. She wore silver earrings, long ones, delicate, the kind that catch light without demanding attention. "Mackenzie," Daniel said, "this is Vivian, my ex-wife." The first thing Vivian did was look at me. Not a social look, not a sizing up look, not the particular guarded assessment that ex-wives sometimes perform when meeting the new person. She looked at me the way you look at something that has confirmed a thing you suspected but hoped was wrong. Long, quiet, with something behind her eyes that was not quite pity and not quite horror, and lived somewhere uncomfortably between the two. And then she smiled. The smile was slow. It arrived the way the horizon arrives when you crest a hill, gradually, then all at once. And it had in it a kind of tired recognition that I cannot fully describe. Like she had been expecting this, had perhaps been dreading this, had perhaps been hoping it wouldn't be this specific, and it was this specific, and now she had to decide what to do with that information. "Mackenzie," she said, and my name in her mouth had a weight I couldn't explain. And then she said, quietly, almost to herself, the words that would come to define the next 8 months of my life. Wow, he really did it again. Daniel laughed a half-laugh, a social smokescreen, and said, "Vive," in a cautionary tone, and Vivian looked at him and something passed between them that was too fast and too loaded for me to read, and then she looked back at me and her smile was now fully social, normalized, contained. "Sorry," she said, "you just remind me of someone. It's nice to meet you." We made small talk for 6 minutes. I know it was 6 minutes because my wine glass was still cold when I gripped it during the conversation, and by the time Daniel steered me gently toward the other side of the room with his hand on my back, it had warmed to body temperature, and a glass of white wine takes approximately that long to warm in a room of that temperature. I counted later in my head, because that's the kind of detail my mind seized in the aftermath. In those 6 minutes, Vivian was composed and pleasant and revealed nothing. She asked what I did for work. She nodded with genuine interest when I said publishing. She asked which house. She said she'd read a book we'd published, said the title correctly. It was one I was proud of having championed. Her voice was low and measured. She had the cadence of a person who thinks before speaking, who does not fill silence with noise. Like me. Like exactly me. I noticed it in that practical, surface-level way you notice a physical similarity in a stranger. Oh, there's a resemblance. And filed it away, and didn't take it out again until I was in bed that night staring at the ceiling while Daniel slept beside me, finally allowing myself to look at what I'd filed. The hair, the dress colour, the jewellery, the voice cadence, the particular way she held her wine glass by the stem, the way I always held mine, because someone had told me once that holding it by the bowl warms the wine, and I'd never held it any other way since. The posture, the stillness, the way she had tilted her head when she said the name of the book, the same 45-degree tilt I knew I did, had been told I did, had seen in photos of myself doing. And then, and this is where the floor began its slow tilt, the ring. I almost missed it. I almost missed it because I hadn't been looking and because my mind was doing the work of a social event, processing many things simultaneously, and it was only now in the ceiling staring dark that I pulled the memory forward and examined it clearly. Vivian's right hand, a silver band, oval stone, not green, I was fairly certain not green, but in the light of Greg Harvison's living room and with the distance between us it had been some jewel tone, deep, saturated. Like mine's. Stop, I told myself. You are inventing a pattern. You met a woman who has similar colouring and similar taste, and you're building a conspiracy out of coincidence, because she said something strange and Daniel got tense, and your brain is doing the thing anxious brains do, which is to find meaning in things that have no meaning. Okay, I told myself. But I lay there for another 2 hours and sleep didn't come, and in the morning my first thought was not Daniel or work or coffee. It was, what colour was Vivian's ring? I didn't ask Daniel about it that morning. He was up early in good spirits making breakfast with the kind of energised ease that he sometimes had on weekends. He made eggs the way I liked them, soft scrambled, never dry, and poured coffee, and was warm and attentive and completely normal, and I watched him and tried to locate the man from last night in this man, the one who had gone slightly still when I mentioned Vivian's comment. She seemed nice, I said eventually, carefully. He looked at me, reading my tone the way he always read my tone, with an accuracy I had always found comforting and now found slightly unnerving in its precision. She is nice, he said. We didn't end badly, we just ended. What did she mean, I said, when she said he really did it again? He was quiet for a moment, pouring coffee, not looking at me. Then, you know Vive, she likes to make an entrance, she thinks she's being witty. I don't actually know Vive, I said. I met her for 6 minutes. She was making a joke, Daniel said, about the fact that I tend to date brunettes. She's always thought it was funny that I have a type. He said it so easily, so completely reasonably. He looked at me and smiled with the particular warmth that had always dissolved my resistance, and I thought, of course, that's all it was. She was making a small, perhaps slightly edged joke about his romantic preferences, the way ex-wives sometimes do when they've processed their grief into something they can laugh about. I nodded, I drank my coffee. I spent the next 3 days trying to believe that. Cora was the first person I told. Not immediately, 4 days after the party, over the phone, while I was walking home from work and needed to say it out loud to someone who would take it seriously without spiraling. She looked like me, I said. How much like you? Enough that it stopped me. Cora was quiet. Stopped you how? Like I stood there and felt something that I don't have a good word for, like vertigo but not physical, like looking in a mirror that isn't quite right. Did Daniel say anything? He said she was making a joke about him dating brunettes. Okay, Cora said slowly. You don't sound convinced. I'm just thinking, she said. Having a type is normal, Kents. Lots of people have a type. This wasn't a type, I said. Types are like tall and blonde or whatever. This was specific, the same jewelry style, the same dress color, the way she holds a wine glass. Another pause, then Cora said carefully, "What did she say exactly?" I told her, verbatim. I'd been turning it over for 4 days and the words were perfectly preserved. "He really did it again," Cora repeated softly. "Yes, Kents. I knows. What are you going to do?" "Nothing," I said. "I'm going to do nothing because there's nothing to do. I'm going to get married in November and I'm going to be rational about this." But even as I said it, I heard myself, and I noticed that I didn't sound like I believed it. The wedding planner thing happened 2 weeks later, and it opened something in me that I then couldn't close. Bryn was in her early 30s, extremely competent, with the organized enthusiasm of someone who had turned a talent for logistics and aesthetic into a career. She had a binder. She had Pantone swatches. She had opinions about centerpieces that she delivered with the confidence of established fact. I liked her immediately. Daniel and I met with her on a Saturday afternoon at her office, which was essentially one large organized room full of fabric samples and magazine tear-outs, and a mood board for what she called the Ashford wedding. She'd already started one because I'd sent her our venue deposit confirmation and a few Pinterest images I'd pinned, which she'd used as a starting point. The mood board was there on the wall when we arrived. Ivory, sage green, silver accents, folk-style music references, wildflowers, a long outdoor table rather than a ballroom layout. "I pulled from the Pinterest board you sent, and some of the details you mentioned in our intake form," Bryn said. "But I also do some early research. I like to look at what couples have done in the past, Instagram if they have it, that kind of thing." "What do you mean, what couples have done in the past?" I said. "Well, I looked at Daniel's social media a bit since you don't have a public Instagram." She smiled at Daniel. "I hope that's okay. I try to get a sense of aesthetic and what a couple responds to visually." Daniel said something neutral. I looked at the mood board. "What did you find?" I said. Bryn tilted her head the same 45 degrees and said pleasantly, "Well, actually it was interesting. The photos I found from, I think, maybe 5-6 years ago, maybe longer, there was a woman in some of them, at what looked like similar events, and her aesthetic was very similar to yours." She paused, clearly processing whether she was saying something awkward. "I just thought the green is already a motif, which is great." She kept talking. I stopped hearing her. I was looking at the mood board, at the sage green and the silver and the wildflowers, at the long outdoor table. I pulled out my phone. I don't know what I was looking for. I went to Daniel's Instagram. He had a relatively inactive account, mostly professional architecture photos and occasional personal ones, and scrolled back. 6 years, 7 years before we met. He'd deleted things. I'd known this in the abstract sense of knowing you don't have access to someone's history. He'd mentioned once that he'd cleaned up his social media after the divorce, but he hadn't deleted everything. There were some photos. In one of them, an outdoor dinner, summer, warm light, there was a woman partially visible on the left edge of the frame. She'd been cropped mostly out, clearly intentional, but a sliver remained. Dark hair, a silver earring catching the light, a shoulder in what appeared to be a green or teal fabric. That was all, a sliver, probably nothing, probably the most banal thing in the world. But I looked at it for too long, sitting in Bryn's office with Daniel beside me talking about centerpieces, and I felt the floor tilt again, that same slow lurch, and I knew, in the way you know things before your brain has assembled them into full knowledge, that something was wrong. I started my investigation not like a detective, and not like a woman scorned. I started it the way a careful reader starts with a text that has troubled her, quietly, slowly, not looking for a conclusion but for clarity. I told myself I was just trying to understand. I told myself that what I found would reassure me, that the story would resolve into something benign, and I would laugh at myself later and marry Daniel in November, and look back on this paranoid spring as a small embarrassing detour. The first thing I did was search for Vivian. Her last name was Ashford still. I discovered through a mutual connection on LinkedIn. She'd kept it after the divorce, which people do for 1,000 reasons, professional continuity most often. Her profile was sparse, but it confirmed she worked in arts administration, specifically museum programming, which was adjacent to my work in publishing in the sense that we both lived inside the world of culture and meaning-making. I noted this with the careful neutrality I was trying to maintain. Her Instagram was public. I almost didn't look. I held my phone with the account open, and I had a whole conversation with myself about whether this was crossing a line, whether it was invasive, whether it was the kind of thing I would regret. And then I looked because I needed to know, because Vivian's face had been living in my head for 2 weeks, and I needed more information than 6 minutes of party conversation had given me. She was beautiful. Let me say that clearly because it matters, not in the same way I was, not identical, but close enough that it caught. She was a few years older than me, I estimated mid-40s based on context clues in her posts. She had chestnut hair, straight shoulder length. She had an oval face, strong features, olive-adjacent skin. She wore silver jewelry almost exclusively. Her home, visible in a few interior shots, was furnished in mid-century modern pieces. In photos from outdoor events and restaurants, she almost always wore jewel tones, deep green, occasionally burgundy. She had a partner now. His name was Marcus based on tags, and he was clearly devoted to her, appeared in photos frequently, and looked at her in the way that good men look at the people they love, not performing it, just feeling it and not bothering to hide it. I thought, good for her. I found a photo of her from about 8 years ago, deep in the archive, before the divorce presumably, that made my hands go slightly numb. It was at what appeared to be a dinner party. She was laughing, head thrown back slightly, and the laugh was caught perfectly. And her hair was down, and she was wearing green, and she had a glass of white wine held by the stem, and she was wearing long silver earrings that were almost precisely, with the minor variations of handmade jewelry, the earrings I was wearing at that moment, sitting on my couch at 11 at night, looking at a stranger's photo on a phone. I set the phone face down on the couch cushion. I sat with my hands in my lap for a very long time. And then I picked the phone back up and I kept looking, because I had always been the kind of person who needed to see the whole shape of a thing, even when the shape was frightening. Let me tell you about the earrings, since they are where I should probably have started paying attention. About 3 years into our relationship, Daniel gave me earrings for my birthday. They were beautiful, long, silver, delicate, with a slight asymmetrical organic shape. He said he'd found them at a boutique in the arts district, that he'd seen them and immediately thought of me. I wore them constantly. I wore them so often that they became part of what people associated with me, Cora had said once. Those earrings are so you, and I had agreed because they felt that way. They felt like an expression of something true about my aesthetic. Vivian's earrings in that 8-year-old photo were not those earrings. They were different earrings, a different maker, a different specific design. But they were the same category of earring, the same language, the same sentence written in a different hand. And looking at them side by side in my head, in the way that I am now very good at looking at things in my head, I understood something that I hadn't understood before. He hadn't given me earrings that were so me. He'd given me earrings that were so her, and over 3 years of wearing them they had become so me, because that's how it works, because we absorb the things we're given as though they were chosen from our own interior. I want to be careful here, I want to be precise, because the worst version of this story, the comfortable, melodramatic version, would have Daniel as a calculating villain who sat down one day and decided to reconstruct his ex-wife inside a new woman. And I don't think that's quite right. I think what's actually true is more disturbing, in the specific way that things are more disturbing when they're murkier, when the line between obsession and love is blurred by the obsessive themselves, when a person genuinely cannot see the difference. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The journal was my co-worker Renata's idea, and she didn't mean it as an investigative suggestion. She meant it in the ordinary human way people suggest journaling, because I had come to work looking not quite right, and she had asked what was wrong, and I had said something vague about relationship stuff, and she had said, "Have you tried writing it down? Sometimes it helps to see it on the page." I went home and I wrote down everything I remembered. Not dramatically, I made a list essentially, the way I would annotate a manuscript with concerns. I wrote down every instance I could recall where Daniel had expressed preferences about my appearance, my interests, my behavior. I wrote down when it happened, how it was phrased, what I'd done in response. The list was longer than I expected. Not long in an alarming, comprehensive control program way. Long in the way that 6 years is long, accumulated small moments that individually mean nothing and collectively mean something. The hair, don't cut it, he'd miss it. The earrings, gift, I'd absorbed them as mine. The jewelry in general, gold doesn't suit you, always silver. The dress colours, warmth when jewel tones, less warmth for others. The folk music, consistently reinforced, other music had faded. The reading preferences, he often suggested books, I'd read most of them, had I stopped choosing for myself as much. The apartment aesthetics, mid-century modern, his preference or mine, both, was there a mine before him? Portugal, a trip I'd wanted to take since college, but had I mentioned it first or had he suggested it? The wine, I'd always held it by the stem, but had I before him, I genuinely couldn't remember. I sat with this list for an hour. Then I made a second list, things that were definitely mine before Daniel, music I'd loved, books I'd chosen, habits I remembered from my 20s, the way I took my coffee, the way I sat cross-legged on furniture because I'd always found it comfortable, my preference for window seats, the way I always propped a book against something rather than holding it unsupported. The two lists were not the same length, and some items on the second list I could not say for certain had survived the 6 years unchanged, or had been subtly shaped by proximity to Daniel's preferences, by the constant low hum of a relationship that had a very clear aesthetic and emotional north. I called Cora on a Thursday night. By this point it had been 3 weeks since the party. I think I need to talk to Vivian, I said. Silence, Kent. I know. What would you even say? I don't know yet. You could be making something out of nothing, Cora said. I know. Daniel might have a completely innocent explanation for all of it. I know. But, she said, and I heard the shift, I've been thinking about what you told me, about the list, and about the earrings. Yes. I don't think you're making something out of nothing, she said quietly. We sat with that for a moment. He loves you, she said. I do believe that. I wonder if he knows the difference between loving you and loving something about you. That sentence stayed with me. I turned it over for days like a stone, looking at what was underneath. I found a way to contact Vivian that wasn't completely insane. We had 2 mutual connections on LinkedIn, people who existed in the overlapping Venn diagram of arts and culture and the city's professional social world. I sent her a connection request with a brief note. We met briefly at Greg and Nancy Harvison's party last month. I hope it's all right to reach out. I'd like to talk if you're open to it. She accepted the connection within 4 hours. She replied within 6. I was wondering if you'd reach out. Coffee, I know a place near the museum that's quiet on weekday mornings, Tuesday at 8. I sat with my phone and read that message 4 times. I was wondering if you'd reach out. She'd been waiting. She had looked at me at that party and she had known, had seen everything in 6 minutes that had taken me 3 weeks to start assembling, and she had waited. Tuesday at 8, I replied. I told Daniel I had an early breakfast meeting with an author. It wasn't a lie I'd planned. It just arrived when he asked, shaped itself quickly, came out of my mouth in the easy way that small defensive lies do when you're protecting something you don't yet know how to explain. He kissed my forehead and said, "Drive safe," and I stood in our apartment for a moment after the door closed behind him and looked around at the mid-century furniture and the folk music, playing from the small speaker in the kitchen and the long silver earrings on the dresser where I'd left them the night before. I put on a different pair of earrings, small gold studs I'd had since college and rarely wore anymore. I don't know why, an instinct. The coffee place near the museum was exactly what Vivian had promised, quiet, good light, the kind of place that takes itself seriously without being pretentious about it. She was already there when I arrived at a corner table, with a coffee and her hands wrapped around the mug, and an expression that I now recognized as her baseline, composed, observant, cautious. We looked at each other for a moment. 2 women who looked more alike than women who'd never met should look. "You're wearing gold," she said. I touched my ear instinctively. "I own gold jewelry," I said. "I just don't wear it often." "He doesn't like gold." It wasn't a question. "He said it doesn't suit my skin tone," I said. He told me the same thing, a pause. "My skin tone is essentially identical to yours." I sat down. "He was right," she said then, "to be fair, in the sense that silver genuinely does look better on us, but that's not why he said it." I looked at her. Why did he say it? She wrapped her hands more tightly around her coffee mug. Because I'd switched to silver about 2 years before the end of our marriage and he liked it and he wanted to make sure you would too. She paused. I'm guessing, but I'm pretty certain I'm right. The coffee shop sounds continued around us, the machine, the quiet conversations, the particular piece of a weekday morning, in a place where people come to think. You said at the party he really did it again, I said. What did you mean? She looked at me directly. I need you to understand, she said, that I'm not trying to blow up your relationship. I'm not vindictive. I'm not here for that. I know, I said. I'm not looking for that either. I just need to understand what I'm in. She nodded slowly. That's fair. And then she told me. She'd met Daniel 18 years ago at a professional event, a fundraiser for an arts organization. She was 27, he was 33. She'd been struck immediately, as most people were, by his quality of attention, the way he focused on a person he was talking to completely, as though the rest of the room had been dimmed. She'd thought, here is someone who sees. They dated for 2 years and married. The first 3 years of the marriage were good, genuinely good. She was clear about this, not rewriting history. He was attentive and devoted and interesting. He had preferences, yes, strong ones, but they were expressed as enthusiasm rather than direction. He loved when she wore green. He loved her hair long. He bought her beautiful silver earrings from a boutique in the arts district. She stopped, and I felt the breath go out of me, and she wore them constantly because they were beautiful, and because he loved them on her. Which boutique? I said. She named it. It was the same boutique. The earrings were different designs, years apart, but the same hands had made the earrings I wore and the earrings she'd worn. He had gone back to the same artisan, 6 years later, and bought a different pair that lived in the same language. She continued. Around year 4 something shifted. She couldn't name it precisely. This is the nature of the shift, she said, that you can feel it without being able to point to it. He became more particular about her appearance. Not critical, never outright critical, but expressive, in the way that someone who loves you becomes expressive about what they love, which sounds like love, which is why it's so difficult to see clearly from inside it. He didn't like when she cut her hair. She'd cut it once about 2 inches, and he'd been quiet for 3 days, not angry, just withdrawn in a way that communicated sadness rather than resentment, which was somehow worse. He began suggesting she was most beautiful in specific colors. He bought her clothing, beautiful clothing, in the colors and silhouettes he loved most, and she wore them because she loved him and because the clothes were genuinely beautiful, and because this is the whole terrible thing, he had good taste. He had genuinely good taste. The things he steered you toward were not bad things. They were beautiful things. That was the trap. The trap, I repeated. Yes, she said. If he'd been steering me wrong, if he'd wanted me to look garish or overdone or wrong, I'd have noticed. But he was steering me right. He was steering me towards something that looked elegant and considered and exactly like my best self, according to him, and it was hard to argue with that when I looked in the mirror and the result was lovely. She paused. The problem wasn't the destination. The problem was that he was driving. Around year 6, she started to feel it more acutely. A low-grade anxiety that she initially attributed to work stress, to the general accumulated weight of building a life. She talked to a therapist, a woman named Dr. Cords, she told me, with a slight something in her voice when she said the name, who began, gently, to point things out. Like what? I said. Like the fact that I described my own preferences as his preferences. Like I'd say, we love folk music, and she'd ask when I'd come to love it, and I'd say I'd always loved it, and then she'd ask what music I'd loved before Daniel, and I'd sit there, and I couldn't, I'd have to really work to remember. And what I remembered felt distant, like it belonged to a different person. I was very still. She asked me once to describe myself as I had been before the relationship, Vivian said. Who I was, what I was like, what I loved, and I sat there in her office and I started crying and I didn't know why I was crying, and then I understood it was because I couldn't do it clearly. I couldn't separate me from him anymore. The borders had dissolved. I thought about my 2 lists, the things that were definitely mine, the things that might have been shaped. Did he know he was doing it? I asked. Was it intentional? She looked out the window for a moment. That's the question, isn't it? She said. I've had 12 years to think about it and I still don't have a clean answer. I think he genuinely loved me. I think he was genuinely devoted. I also think he had a very specific idea of who he wanted me to be, and he was very slowly and very lovingly making me into that person, and I think the two things existed simultaneously in him without contradiction. He didn't see it as control. He saw it as love. He saw it as curating the best version of something he treasured. "That's terrifying," I said. "Yes," she said, "it is." She told me the marriage ended not because of a single event but because of a conversation. They were 7 years in, and she had, over the previous year, been quietly reclaiming things, listening to music she'd loved before him, spending time with friends he'd never particularly encouraged, considering a haircut she'd been thinking about for years. She wasn't doing it strategically. She was doing it instinctively, the way you do when you feel yourself getting lost and you reach for the things that were yours before. He noticed. He didn't say anything directly, but she could feel the noticing, the way you can feel temperature change in a room even when you can't see the source. One night during dinner, she looked across the table at him and she said, "I've been thinking about going back to music I used to love, like the stuff from my 20s that I don't listen to much anymore." He'd looked at her with that expression, not anger, not hostility, something more complicated, something like a person watching a piece of something beautiful start to change in a way they can't prevent. "Why?" he'd said. "Because I miss it," she said. "It's just music." "Of course," he said and smiled, and said nothing more. But the dinner had ended in a silence that felt different from his usual comfortable quiet, and she'd gone to bed that night with a cold certainty that something had broken, or that something was breaking, and that she didn't know whether she was the one breaking it. The conversation came 3 weeks later. Not a fight, she was clear about this. He was not a man who fought. He sat across from her and said, with the particular composure of someone who has organized his feelings carefully before expressing them, "I feel like you've been moving away from me." She said, "I've been moving toward myself." And he looked at her with something that was, she believed, genuine grief, not performance, not manipulation, actual grief, because from inside his understanding of what their marriage was, she was right. She was moving away from him. Because for him, the marriage was a specific thing, a specific aesthetic and emotional landscape, and she was altering the landscape, and it felt to him like loss. "I don't think he understood," Vivian said, "that what felt to him like her moving away from him was actually me trying to find out who I was." She'd asked for a divorce 3 months later. He hadn't contested it. He'd been, according to her, devastatingly sad in a way that she believed was real, that had made her second-guess herself for years. She didn't doubt that he'd loved her. She doubted that he'd ever fully seen her. "And then," I said. She looked at me. "And then I spent 2 years figuring out who I was," she said. "And then I met Marcus. And Marcus," she paused and a small private smile came, the real kind, the kind that isn't for anyone else. "Marcus loves me in a way where I can feel myself, where I haven't disappeared, where I know the difference between me and the relationship." "Good," I said, and I meant it, and I also felt something cold moving through me. "There was one more thing," she said. "Before we met, before you and Daniel, I knew a woman, a friend of a friend, someone Daniel had been serious about. She was between me and you, I think, 3 years after the divorce." "What was she like?" Vivian held my gaze. "Brown hair," she said. "Hazel eyes, about your height. She wore silver jewelry. She loved folk music and Morrison and cooking from scratch and the coast of Portugal." The coffee shop sounds continued around us. Someone was playing something soft. "Did they stay together?" I said. "No, she ended it. I don't know the full story, I only know her peripherally. But she ended it, and afterward she told our mutual friend that she'd felt like she was slowly becoming someone she didn't recognize." Vivian paused. "The friend told me this years before I met you, before I knew Daniel was seeing anyone new." "But when you saw me at the party..." "I saw her," Vivian said, "or me, or some version of the same person, and I thought he found another one. And then I thought, no, he didn't find one, he made one." The drive home from the coffee shop took 22 minutes. I know because I watched the clock in a dissociated, careful way, focusing on the numbers the way you focus on a fixed point when the room is spinning. 22 minutes of the radio playing something I didn't process, and the city moving past the windows and my hands on the wheel doing the automatic competent thing that hands on wheels do. "He made one." I turned that sentence over and over. I need to be fair here. I need to keep being fair because fairness is how I keep my grip on reality during periods when reality is doing something that feels deeply unfair. Here is what was certain, empirically. Daniel had an ex-wife who looked like me and had similar tastes, and had told me something disturbing at a party. He had apparently dated another woman between them who fit a similar description. He had, over 6 years, made it clear that he had specific preferences about my appearance and aesthetics, and those preferences happened to align with qualities that resembled his ex-wife. That was what was certain. What was not certain, whether this was intentional engineering, whether Daniel was conscious of what he was doing, whether I had been selected because I already resembled Vivian and then shaped further, or whether I was a woman with naturally similar colouring and tastes who Daniel had fallen for genuinely, and then loved in the only way he knew how to love, which was the particular controlling love of someone who had a very clear vision of the thing he treasured. The distinction mattered. Not for my decision, I was increasingly certain about my decision, even if I wasn't ready to name it yet, but for my understanding of what my 6 years had actually been, what Daniel had done and what he had felt, and whether those two things were the same. I went home. Daniel wasn't back yet. I stood in the apartment and looked at it, really looked at it, the way you look at a room when you're trying to decide if it's yours. The furniture was mid-century modern. Clean lines, organic shapes, the aesthetic Daniel had brought with him when he moved in and that I had agreed with fully because I had thought it was my aesthetic too. But was it? Had it been? I tried to remember the apartment I'd had before Daniel, before he moved in. I'd had a couch, a blue velvet couch that I'd had in my first real apartment that I'd loved, that had followed me through 3 moves and that I'd sold when Daniel moved in because it didn't fit the aesthetic we were building together. Why had I sold it? Because it didn't fit. Why didn't it fit? Because Daniel's furniture was different, and we'd chosen together, I reminded myself, we'd spent weekends at furniture stores making joint decisions. But I also remembered, now that I was excavating, that most of the pieces I'd loved at the store and not ended up with were the ones Daniel had gently expressed reservations about. It's a little too casual for this room. I think we'd get tired of that silhouette. And I'd nodded and moved on because I was building something with someone I loved, and that required compromise. Compromise. I walked around the apartment touching things lightly. The books on the shelves, a mix of mine and his, integrated years ago, a joint library now. My section had been heavily colonized by his recommendations. There were whole authors I'd read solely because Daniel had suggested them, and I'd loved them, genuinely loved them, but they'd displaced space where my own choices would have been. The music library on the speakers, folk, Americana, the acoustic things that filled our evenings. I thought about the playlist on my phone. I pulled it up. Folk, some classical. Daniel liked more folk. I scrolled back to a playlist I'd made in 2018, a year into the relationship. There was more variety. Indie stuff, things I'd listened to alone, music that didn't share the aesthetic of what I now listened to almost exclusively. I scrolled back further, 2015 before I met him, entirely different landscape. The green dress was in my closet. I looked at it. I didn't say anything to Daniel that day. I made dinner, we ate, we watched something, we went to bed. I was present in the surface sense, performing the evening, and he was warm and ordinary and loving in his particular way, and I watched him and tried to see through the love to what was underneath it. The problem was that the love looked real. It looked entirely real. He refilled my water glass without being asked. He laughed at something I said with the complete laugh, not a social one. He reached for my hand across the table the way he always did, unconsciously, as if his hand simply belonged near mine. None of this was performance. I was nearly certain of that. Whatever Daniel was doing, and however it had damaged me, the love was not fake. Which made it harder, not easier. The hardest kind of harm to leave is the harm that arrives inside something genuine. The harm that isn't malice but is harm nonetheless. The harm that has the face of love and the hands of control, and the intention of devotion and the effect of erasure. I made an appointment with a therapist. Not Daniel's therapist, he didn't have one that I knew of. Mine, a woman named Dr. Anita Lowe, who I'd seen briefly in my early 30s and with whom I'd parted amicably when things had stabilized, and whom I'd always kept in my contacts with a vague sense that I might need her again. I called her office Monday morning. She had a slot Thursday afternoon. In the meantime, I kept investigating. I want to be careful about how I describe what I found over the next 2 weeks because I want to be accurate rather than sensational. I was not in this period spiraling into obsession. I was doing the thing I have always done with difficult texts, reading carefully, noting things, refusing to interpret until I had enough data. I was a reader and the text was my own relationship, and I was trying to understand what I had been reading. I went through old photos on my own phone first, 6 years of photos. I was looking for the subtle things, the trajectory of visible change in myself. What I found was this: my hair in the earliest photos with Daniel 3-4 months in was slightly shorter than it was now, and had a slight natural wave that I'd mostly abandoned in favor of a straighter style. This seemed trivial until I remembered that Daniel had mentioned a few times, warmly, that he loved when my hair fell straight. Not criticism, just preference. And the preference had been received and apparently enacted so slowly that I'd never noticed. My clothing in early photos skewed more varied than it did now. There was a yellow sundress, the one I'd thought about while looking at the apartment. There was a cream linen blazer I'd loved and hadn't worn in years. There was a phase of patterned blouses that I'd apparently moved away from entirely. The current wardrobe was more tonal, more jewel-coloured, more refined, in a way that looked intentional and considered. The earlier wardrobe had been more like me trying things, being various, being exploratory in the way of someone who hasn't yet been curated. I thought about the word curated. Daniel used it sometimes as a compliment. He'd describe a dinner or a bookshelf or a room as beautifully curated, and it was always a compliment, and it had seeped into my vocabulary so that I used it now too. But the word curator, I thought, implies someone making choices for a collection, and the collection, in the intimate context of a relationship, was me. I found Vivian's Instagram again and looked at her photos from around the time she would have met Daniel, years 18 to 25 or so in my estimation of the archive, and then I looked at photos of her from later in the marriage, and then from after. It was subtle, but there, an early photo of Vivian before Daniel showed her in a red dress, gold earrings, hair shorter and with more body. The photo was blurry and small, but it existed. And then across the years of marriage, the shift: longer hair, straighter silver jewelry appearing and gold disappearing, jewel tones emerging. And then post-marriage, post-Marcus, a slow return. The red appeared again, occasional gold. The hair had been cut shorter and allowed to have its wave. She had gone back to herself. Or toward herself. I wondered if you could ever fully go back once the borders had dissolved, or whether it was more like rebuilding a wall from rubble. The wall exists again, but the rubble remains, and you know which stones were once broken. I told Dr. Lowe almost everything at the first session. Not everything, I was still assembling it, but enough. The meeting with Vivian, the lists I'd made, the photographs, the earrings. She listened with the particular quality of attention that good therapists have, which is not unlike the quality of attention Daniel had, I noted, and then noted the nodding, and wondered briefly and quietly whether I'd been drawn to Daniel in part because he listened like a therapist, which was the closest thing to being truly seen that I'd encountered in my adult life. When you made the list, Dr. Lowe said, the one of things that were definitely yours before the relationship, how did you feel making it? Strange, I said, like trying to describe a country you haven't visited in years. You know the shape of it, but the details are blurry. That's important to name, she said, that feeling. I know what it means. Tell me. It means I've lost some of myself. The words arrived without drama because I had been moving toward them for 3 weeks, and they were no longer shocking, just factual. Whether through my own choices or through his influence or through some combination, I'm less clear about who I am outside this relationship than I was when I entered it. Is that unusual in long relationships? It might not be unusual, I said, but the nature of it feels unusual. It feels directional, like it wasn't just the normal blurring that happens when you build a life with someone, it was steered. She was quiet for a moment. Have you talked to Daniel about what you found? Not yet. Why not? I thought about this carefully. Because I don't have the full picture yet, I said, and because I'm afraid of what I'll do with his response. What do you mean? I mean that he will have an explanation, I said. He always has explanations. He is very good at explanations, at making the concerning thing reasonable. And I'm afraid that his explanation will work on me, that I'll be convinced, and I'll close the door on this before I've fully looked through it. I don't trust myself to confront him and hold on to my clarity at the same time. Not yet. Dr. Lowe looked at me for a moment. Then she said, that's a very self-aware thing to understand about yourself. He's very persuasive, I said. In a very gentle way, he doesn't argue, he explains. And his explanations are always internally consistent. They don't have visible holes in them. The problem is that they're consistently oriented toward reassuring me, not toward truth necessarily. Toward managing you, she said. I don't know if it's that deliberate. It might not be, she said, but the effect can be management even without the intention being management. Yes, I thought that was it exactly. I want to talk about Daniel's mother, Margaret, because she existed in this story in a way that mattered and that I understood only later. Margaret Ashford was 70, a former art teacher, a woman of strong opinions delivered with the gentleness of someone who has learned that directness is most effective when it doesn't feel like directness. She lived an hour outside the city in the house where Daniel had grown up, and we visited her 4 or 5 times a year, and I liked her. I had genuinely liked her. She was interesting and warm, and she made a very good risotto. She had also, I began to understand in retrospect, been quietly, consistently involved in the maintenance of Daniel's world. Little things, when I'd mentioned once at her kitchen table that I was thinking about taking on a new role at work that would involve a lot more travel, she had said very gently, not with any apparent agenda, "Oh, but wouldn't that be hard on you and Daniel? The time apart," and I had said, "We'd make it work," and she had said, "Of course you would," with a smile that contained something I couldn't name. And I hadn't taken the role. Not because of her, I'd told myself. Because the timing wasn't right. But now I thought, had it been right? Had I decided it wasn't right partly because the people around me had communicated, in their gentle ways, that my stability and availability were important to Daniel's happiness? Margaret had always praised the apartment's aesthetic, every time she visited. "You two have such a beautiful home," she'd say, and she'd specifically admire the mid-century pieces. And when she was in my closet once looking for something, I forget what, she'd seen the yellow sundress I'd kept in the back and said with no particular edge, "I don't think I've seen you wear that," and I'd said, "It doesn't really go with anything," and she'd said, "No, probably not," and moved on. I thought about that dress. I went to the back of my closet that night after dinner after Daniel had gone to work in his office. I pushed past things. The yellow sundress was still there, not thrown away, just receded. I took it out and held it. It was a nice dress, simple cut but a yellow linen. I had bought it 3 years before I met Daniel, and I had loved it then without reservation. I put it on, standing in the closet in the dark, and I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. I looked fine, I looked like myself, I didn't look wrong. I thought about what Daniel would say if I came out of the bedroom in this dress. I could hear the sentence before it was said, "Oh, that's fun, though I always thought you were most yourself in," and then he'd name something green, something specific to his vision of me. I took the dress off and hung it back up in the front of the closet this time. I moved it deliberately to a place where I'd see it. The first crack appeared on a Wednesday, about 3.5 weeks after the party. We were having dinner, something I'd cooked, pasta, a recipe I'd developed over years that Daniel loved and requested often. He was telling me about a project at work, a bridge redesign, and I was listening, and the evening had the familiar texture of our best evenings, comfortable and connected and warm. And then, without planning it, I said, "Daniel, what was Vivian's favourite colour?" He paused, just briefly, a half-second, the kind of pause that would be invisible to someone who wasn't looking for it. Then, "I don't think she had one." "Why?" "What did she usually wear to events?" "I don't, Mackenzie, that was over 12 years ago." "Green," I said, "jewel tones." He was looking at me now with the reading expression, the one where he was processing what was happening and preparing the appropriate response. "She wore a lot of colours," he said. "You're thinking about the party, you've been in your head about this." "I've been thinking, yes." "And what are you thinking?" The dinner was still on the table between us, steam from the pasta, the gentle sound of the neighbourhood outside the windows. I watched him and I thought, he will explain this. He will find the explanation that makes sense of all of it. He is very good at that. "I'm thinking about how much we look alike," I said, "Vivian and I." "You both have dark hair and are similar in colouring," he said. "I have a physical type. That's not Mackenzie, that's incredibly normal." "I know. So why does it feel like you're building a case?" "Because I am," I thought, but not for the reason he thought. "I'm just trying to understand," I said. "The jewellery, the earrings you gave me, you got them from the same boutique you used for her." He was very still now. I'd done research. He hadn't expected me to know that. "I've been going to that boutique for years," he said. "Because it's good, because the work is beautiful." "Both times you bought earrings for the woman you were with?" Because both of you wear silver. Because the work is right for that style. He wasn't wrong technically. He wasn't technically wrong about anything he was saying. That was the architecture of his explanations, technically correct, oriented toward innocence, exhaustively reasonable. Daniel, I said. Mackenzie. What color was Vivian's engagement ring? A silence that was longer than it needed to be. It was a sapphire, he said. Blue, why? I looked at my hand, the oval emerald. Not green, I said. Not green, he said, as you can see. But the pause before he'd answered. I had heard a pause before an answer, and my body, which was more honest than my mind during that period, felt it like a stone dropping into water. I don't want to fight about this, he said, and his voice was tired rather than defensive, genuinely tired, the way a person sounds when they have been accused of something they believe is unfair. I love you. I've loved you for 6 years and I'm going to marry you in November. If you're nervous about the wedding, about the commitment, I want to talk about that. But I'm not going to keep sitting here while you build a case against me out of things like what color someone's ring was 12 years ago. It was a good speech. It was a very good speech. I felt it work on me in the way his explanations always worked, smoothing the rough places, suggesting an alternative narrative that was both plausible and flattering, and had me as the neurotic one rather than him as the controlling one. I said, I'm not nervous about the wedding. Then what? I looked at him for a long moment. I'm not sure yet, I said, and I let it lie there. And we finished dinner in a silence that was different from our comfortable silences, a silence that had things in it. That night I lay awake again, and I thought about what I knew and what I suspected, and where the line between them was. And I thought about Vivian's words, he made one, and I turned them over in the dark and I tried to understand what they meant at their most specific. Not, he found a woman who already resembled her, though possibly that was the beginning. Not, he deliberately created a Pygmalion situation with full consciousness and calculated intent, though possibly that was the mechanism. But he had an idea of who he loved, a specific detailed idea formed around a specific woman, and when that woman left him, was lost to him, he sought the feeling again. Not her, but the experience of her. And the most efficient path to that experience was to find the closest approximation, and then slowly, lovingly, over years, refine the approximation further. And possibly this was the part that made my stomach go cold. Possibly he didn't know he was doing it. Possibly for him it felt like love, like caring, like the particularly intimate form of devotion in which you know someone well enough to help them be their best self. Dr. Lowe had said, the effect can be management even without the intention being management. The effect in this case was that I didn't know anymore where the original Mackenzie ended, and the Mackenzie that Daniel had spent 6 years carefully tending and shaping began. And I needed to know. That was the thing I'd discovered, lying in the dark. I needed to know that more than I needed anything else, including the relationship, including the wedding, including the life I'd been building with this man I loved. Because here was the understanding that had arrived slowly like dawn coming. Love without the self to love from is not love. It is need, it is attachment, it is the elaborate performance of love. But if you have been shaped out of your original form, if the person doing the loving is performing a version of yourself that was curated by the lover, then who is loving and who is being loved? He was loving a reflection, and I had been living in a mirror. I called the woman, the one Vivian had mentioned, the one between them, the woman Daniel had dated 3 years after the divorce. It took me a week to find her. I will spare the details of how, but the mutual friend existed, and she existed, and her name was Stella, and she lived across the country now, and she was gracious and measured on the phone when I explained who I was and what I was trying to understand. I know who you are, she said. Vive mentioned you. Did she? She said she'd finally met the new one and that it had been jarring. A pause. I'm sorry, that sounds harsh. It's accurate, I said. Are you still with him? For now, I said. Can you tell me what happened? You don't have to, but if you're willing. Stella was quiet for a moment. I was with him for about 8 months, she said. Long enough for me to notice what was happening, but not so long that I didn't still know clearly what the before, Daniel me had been. What did you notice? The hair comments, she said. The jewelry, the fact that my music library started to drift, the colors. She said it with the particular exhaustion of someone cataloguing something they've already catalogued many times in their own head. He bought me earrings from the boutique, I said. Yes, a pause. He took me to Portugal. I closed my eyes. On that trip, Stella said, we stayed at a small inn on the coast. He'd been before, he said. He knew the area well. She paused again. I thought he meant with friends. I assumed. I didn't ask. He'd been with Vivian, I said. Almost certainly. She was quiet. Mackenzie, can I ask you something? Yes. When you try to describe yourself, who you are, what you love, how much of it can you confidently say was yours before him? I looked out the window. Less than I'd like, I said. That's what it felt like, she said. When I left, like I was less than I'd been, like I was leaving with fewer things that were mine than I'd arrived with, even though I'd been given a lot in between. A beat. He gave me beautiful things. I want to be honest about that. He was generous and devoted, and the love felt real. I believed the love was real. I also believed that the love was not for me exactly. It was for an idea he had, and I happened to fit the sketch well enough that he hired me for the part. Did you leave, I said, or did he? I left, she said. It took longer than it should have. I think I should tell you about the folder. I found it on a Sunday, about 5 weeks after the party, when Daniel was at a work site and wouldn't be home until evening. I hadn't been snooping exactly. I'd been looking for a specific document in the shared filing cabinet we kept in the home office, something related to a lease renewal, and I'd opened the wrong drawer. The folder was unlabeled, manila thick. I don't know how long I stood there looking at it before I picked it up, long enough for my hands to steady themselves from the involuntary unsteadiness that had arrived when I saw it. Inside, photographs, printed, which already felt strange in the age of digital everything, printed and kept in a physical folder in a cabinet. Photos of Vivian, taken during the marriage, years of them, the kind of photos you take of someone you love, candid moments, dinners, travels, the texture of a life together. Many of them. And then about halfway through the stack, the photographs changed. These were not personal photographs. These were, I held one and looked at it, and my mind worked to name what I was seeing, reference photographs, the kind you might take of something you want to remember or recreate. Close-up photos of a green dress, a photo of silver earrings on a surface, a photo of a table setting at a specific restaurant, the kind of table setting you might want to replicate. A photo of the coast of Portugal, a specific inlet, the kind of photo that anchors a memory in visual detail. And then near the back, 3 photos of me. Recent ones, printed from my own social media, presumably, public photos, and also one that appeared to have been taken without my knowledge, candid, me in a green coat I wore often, walking somewhere hair down. I set the folder on the desk. I sat down in the office chair. I sat there for approximately 20 minutes by the clock on the wall, though I couldn't have told you how long it felt. Here is what I felt in that chair, not fear, not rage, something more foundational than either of those things, something like the specific dizziness of having the ground confirmed as the thing you suspected, not relieved that you were right, not vindicated, just experiencing the particular solidity of a suspicion becoming a fact. He kept photographs of his ex-wife, years of them, hidden in a cabinet. He kept reference photos of the aesthetic elements he associated with her, the dress, the jewelry, the locations, and he had printed photos of me and placed them in the same folder. He was maintaining a catalogue. I was in the catalogue. I had always been in the catalogue from before we met. He had seen me somewhere at that dinner party, and I had fit the sketch, and he had pursued me, and I had opened the door, and for 6 years he had been lovingly, devotedly, perhaps unconsciously turning me into the best version of the thing he kept in the catalogue. I replaced the folder exactly as I'd found it. I left the office. I made coffee and I sat in the kitchen and I drank it, and I looked at the mid-century table and the folk music speaker and the carefully curated shelf of books, and I looked at my long straight chestnut, hair reflected in the dark window above the sink. And I thought, what do I do with this? I could confront him tonight. I could lay it out, the folder, Vivian's account, Stella's account, my lists, everything, and watch him explain it. And he would explain it, and the explanations would be partially reasonable, and I would be left in the same position I'd been in but more compromised, having revealed everything I knew without yet knowing what I was going to do. Or I could take more time. Not much more. I was running out of the capacity to perform normal evenings while carrying this but a little more time to get clearer on exactly what I wanted from the confrontation, what I wanted the outcome to be. I thought about what I wanted. I thought about it with the kind of rigorous honesty that I usually only apply to manuscripts, the kind where you strip away what you want to want and look at what's actually underneath. I didn't want to be right. I'd have been overjoyed to be wrong. I'd have happily accepted the explanation that made all of this innocent, that rendered me a paranoid woman who had spun a conspiracy out of coincidence and a folder of sentimental photographs. But I was going to marry this man in 5 months. I was going to legally bind myself to him. And somewhere beneath the love, beneath the 6 years, beneath the genuine warmth and compatibility and all the real and beautiful things we'd built together, was a man who kept a catalogue, who had, knowingly or not, spent years on the project of making me resemble his ex-wife, who had shaped my hair and my jewelry and my music and my colours and my interests in ways that I had absorbed as my own choices and that were not entirely my own choices. That man was real. The other man, the loving, devoted, attentive man who made soft scrambled eggs and refilled water glasses and read in the same room with me, was also real. They were the same man, and I needed to decide what to do with that. That night when Daniel came home, I was at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and a book, and when he came in he kissed my temple and poured himself a glass and sat across from me and said, "Good day." "Good enough," I said. He reached across the table and rested his hand on my forearm. His thumb moved in the small reassuring motion he'd always done, and I felt it, and I felt myself respond to it the way I always had, with warmth and a kind of physical settling, and underneath that, the cold, quiet knowledge. "I love you," he said. "I know," I said. And both things were true. I called Vivian again, not to meet, just to ask one specific thing that had been circling in my head. "The folder," I said when she picked up. Did he keep photographs of you, of things associated with you?" A silence. "I found one," she said. "A box, actually, in a closet in the house we shared. I found it about a year before I asked for the divorce. It had photos, some things, a scarf of mine he said he'd thrown away but hadn't, a receipt from a restaurant we'd gone to on a specific anniversary." "And you didn't think it was dangerous?" "I thought it was grief," she said. "I thought it was the behavior of someone who loved deeply and sometimes held on too hard. I probably should have asked a therapist at the time." A pause. "But looking back, it wasn't the behavior of someone processing loss. It was the behavior of someone who couldn't let go of an idea, and the idea happened to look like me." "He has one now," I said. "A folder with photos of you from the marriage and reference photos of specific objects, your dress colour, jewellery." Vivian was quiet for a long moment. "And photos of you." "And photos of me." She let out a breath. "Mackenzie." "I know. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to talk to him," I said. "I just needed to be certain first. Before I talked to him, I needed to be certain that I wasn't constructing this." "You're not constructing it," she said, with the simple directness of someone who has no motive to lie. "No," I said, "I know." Dr. Lowe and I talked for 2 hours in our second session, which was unusual. She typically kept to 50 minutes. But she was available, and I needed to think out loud, and she was willing to let the thinking be as long as it needed to be. I described the folder. I described Stella's account. I described the whole architecture as I now understood it, spread out for examination the way you spread a manuscript on a large table to look at the structure. "He loved her," I said. "Vivian. He loved her genuinely, and she left, and he couldn't process the loss in a way that allowed him to move forward cleanly. So instead he found ways to." "To what?" Dr. Lowe said gently. "To not fully grieve it," I said. "To keep it present, first through the catalogue, then through Stella, then through me." "And the shaping," she said. "And the shaping," I said, because finding someone who already resembled her wasn't enough, because the resemblance would always be approximate, so he fine-tuned it, over years, very gently with great love in a way that felt like devotion. I stopped. And maybe it was devotion, but it was devotion to Vivian-shaped thing, not to me. "Not to you as you were," Dr. Lowe said, "to a version of you he was collaborating on." "Except I didn't know I was collaborating." "No, we sat with that." "What does it feel like," Dr. Lowe said, "when you try to identify what is originally and unambiguously yours? What feelings come up? I thought carefully. Grief, I said eventually. Not rage, just grief, for the things I might have given away unknowingly, the music I don't listen to anymore, the dress in the back of the closet, the haircut I never got. I paused. And also something else, something like urgency, like I'm standing at the edge of something and I need to step back before I go any further in. In what direction? In the direction of becoming less and less recognizably myself, I said. There's a point, I think there's a point past which you can't come back clearly, where too much has been given over. Vivian seemed like she'd come back, but it took her years and she said it wasn't a full return, it was rebuilding. I looked at my hands. I'm 40 years old. I don't want to spend the next several years rebuilding what I am. I want to live from what I am. Dr. Lowe looked at me. You've already made a decision, she said. Yes, I said. Have you named it yet? Not to him, but to yourself. I looked at the window, the city outside going about its ordinary business. Yes, I said, to myself. I called my best friend Cora and I told her everything. The full version. The folder, the conversations with Vivian and Stella, the lists, all of it. We talked for 3 hours. At some point she was crying and at some point I was crying, and at some point we were both silent, sitting on opposite ends of a phone call with a 6-year relationship spread out between us, examining it. I always thought something was off, she said. I want to be honest about that, I didn't have language for it, but there was something that felt. Like he loved me very specifically, I said. Like he loved a version of you, she said. And that version kept getting more refined, more inconsistent, like you were being edited. She was a graphic designer, she thought in visual terms. The metaphor hit me somewhere that ached. Edited, I said, yes. Are you going to end it? Yes. She exhaled. Okay, not surprised, just processing. Are you going to be okay? Eventually, I said. I think I need to be Mackenzie for a while before I'm okay. I need to excavate who that is. I know who that is, Cora said, and her voice was warm with it. She's the woman who bought a blue velvet couch because she loved it, and ate Indian food every Tuesday, and listened to whatever she wanted, and cried at movies and didn't hide it, and once walked 2 miles in the wrong direction because she was too stubborn to admit she was lost, and ended up finding the best dumpling place she'd ever been to. I started crying, not dramatically, just quietly, the way I always cried in the car or in the kitchen or on the phone. With controlled grief rather than spectacle. I miss her, I said. She's still there, Cora said. She didn't go anywhere, she just got buried under someone else's idea of her. I need to tell you about the confrontation, but first I need to tell you about the week before it. I took the yellow dress out of the closet and wore it to work on a Thursday. Nobody said anything dramatic about it, Renata said, "Oh, cute dress," and went back to her manuscript, but I wore it all day and I felt, beneath the ordinary discomfort of wearing something unfamiliar after years of a different aesthetic, something that I can only call orientation, like a compass finding north after being close to something that had been disrupting the field. I made a playlist on my phone, things I'd loved before Daniel, indie music, folk music that was genuinely mine and not curated for the relationship, folk music, some hip-hop I'd loved at 30, things I'd listened to in graduate school. I played it in the kitchen while cooking and it felt strange, and then it felt like myself, and the strangeness was just the feeling of re-encountering something you'd lost track of. I went to the boutique, the one where he'd bought the earrings. I don't know why exactly. Maybe I just needed to see the place to make it concrete. It was a small, well-lit shop in the arts district run by a woman in her 60s named Fern, who made everything herself, silver, organic shapes. I walked around for a while, and then I asked Fern, without quite planning to, whether she remembered selling earrings to a man named Daniel Ashford. "Oh, Daniel," she said, and her face did something familiar. "He's been coming in for years. He brought his wife in once, a lovely woman, dark hair. And then I think his girlfriend, another dark-haired woman, and I assume," she looked at my ears, "those are mine." "They are," I said. "He always wanted something similar to the first pair," she said. I had to explain I didn't make the same piece twice. He asked for something in the same language, he called it, the same language. I stood in the shop for a moment. "He wanted the same language," I said. "He wanted the feeling to be the same," she said, with the practical understanding of someone who makes objects for living. "People do that. They find something that resonates and they want it again." Thank you, I said. They're beautiful work. They suit you, she said. They did, I said, and I took them out of my ears right there and handed them to her. I wonder if you'd buy these back, or not buy, just take them. They should be someone else's. She looked at them in my palm, then at my face. Then she took them gently and said, I hope you find what you're looking for. I walked out of the shop. My ears felt strangely light. I bought myself different earrings that afternoon from a different shop, a small oxidized bronze pair with irregular shapes, chunky and interesting and not silver and not Daniel. I wore them home. When Daniel saw them, he said, New earrings, in the tone that I now knew meant he was registering something unusual, something that didn't fit, and he was processing whether to say so directly. Yes, I said. They're interesting, he said, not really your usual thing. I know, I said, I'm trying something different. He looked at me, then nodded, then said sure and moved toward the kitchen. But he watched me during dinner in the particular way he had when something was wrong, when something needed to be resolved, and I sat across from him, and I knew that the time had come, and I wasn't ready, and I was going to do it anyway. Daniel, I said, I found the folder. He went still, the complete stillness, not the partial one, like everything stopped, like the system paused. I know about the photographs, I said, of Vivian, of the things associated with her, and of me. He set his fork down. I've talked to Vivian, I said, and to Stella. I know about Portugal. I know about the boutique and the earrings and the dress colours and all of it. He looked at me for a long time without saying anything, and I thought, here it comes, the explanation, the smoothing, the internally consistent narrative. But instead he said quietly, How long have you known? And that surprised me, not the explanation, just how long. Since the party, I said, 5 weeks. He looked down at the table. He was doing something I hadn't seen him do before, or hadn't let myself see. He was struggling. Not performing struggle, actually struggling. His face had something on it that was not the composed, emotionally managed expression he usually wore, but something underneath that, something rawer. He started, stopped, started again. I don't know how to explain it in a way that doesn't sound. Honest, I said, just honest, for once no explanation, just honesty. He looked at me. I loved her, he said. Vivian, I loved her in a way that, when she left, something, I don't know how to say this, something closed. Okays. And I really thought that finding someone who felt like that, like her, would open it again. Did it? He was quiet. Yes and no, he said. You're not her, I know you're not her, I know that. But there were things about you, things I was drawn to, and over time I wanted those things to stay the way they were when I fell in love with you, and when I sensed them changing. You redirected them, I said. He didn't deny it. He sat there and he didn't deny it. The folder, I said, the photographs. I kept it, I couldn't, he stopped. His hands were flat on the table. I couldn't let go of it cleanly, that time, that period. I kept it because it helped me feel connected to something you'd lost. Yes. And then you put me in the folder. He looked at me and his face was doing something that I recognized as grief. Not performed grief, the actual thing. I didn't realize I'd done it, he said. That's what I need you to understand. I wasn't conscious of it as strategy. He stopped. I saw you at that dinner and you felt familiar, in the best possible way, like something I recognized, and I thought that was love. Maybe it was, I said, and maybe it was also finding a replacement, he said. The word sat there between us. Yes, I said. We sat for a very long time. I would have married you, he said, and meant it. I know, I said. I love you. I know that too, I said. But I need to know who I am, Daniel. I need to know that independently of you. And right now I can't do that inside this relationship. Because inside this relationship, the edges of what's me and what's your idea of me are blurred, and I need those edges back. He was quiet. I don't know if I can fix this, he said. I'm not asking you to fix it tonight, I said. I'm asking for time and space to figure out whether there's a this to fix. It was generous of me perhaps to leave that door open, more generous than I probably needed to be, given the folder, given all of it. But I am, as I said, not a dramatic person, and he was genuinely suffering, and the suffering was genuinely real. And I have never found satisfaction in the suffering of someone I've loved, even someone who has hurt me. I stayed that night. I slept in our bed, but in the morning I called Cora and asked if I could come stay for a few days. Daniel was in the shower when I packed a bag. I took the yellow dress. I took the bronze earrings. I took 3 books that I was nearly certain were mine before him. I left the earrings from the boutique. I'd already given them to Fern, and I left the green dresses and most of the carefully curated life we'd built, because I didn't know yet which parts were mine, and I needed space to figure it out rather than taking everything and sorting it later. I wrote him a note, I need some time. I'll be at Cora's, we can talk when I'm ready. I drove to Cora's apartment with the windows down and the early June air coming in and the playlist from my 20s playing, and I cried somewhere on the highway, not dramatically, just the kind of crying you do when a door closes on something, when the specific grief of a real and complicated love settles in, and then I stopped crying, and I played the next song, and I drove. I stayed at Cora's for 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks were not what I expected them to be, which I think is the nature of crisis. The predicted shape doesn't match the actual experience. I had expected to feel bereft, disoriented, desperate. I felt those things, but not predominantly. What I felt predominantly was something I want to describe carefully because it's important. I felt the particular aliveness of someone who has stopped holding their breath. Not relief exactly, more than relief. The specific aliveness of inhabiting yourself again after a period of partial inhabitation, like coming back into a room that you'd vacated without fully realizing you'd left. I ate Indian food 3 times that first week. Cora and I went to the Indian place on 9th Street that we'd been going to for 12 years, and it tasted exactly like it always had, like the most reliable version of everything, and I sat across from her, and I thought about how she had looked at me with that unreadable expression when I'd told her about Daniel in the early days, and I understood now that what she'd been feeling was something like prescient concern, which had been translated into watchfulness because she'd loved me and not wanted to be wrong. You weren't wrong, I said. I didn't know exactly, she said. I just thought something's off. Something was off, I said. You're going to be okay, she said. I'm going to be someone, I said. That feels more specific and also more important. I went back to the apartment after 2 weeks to begin the longer conversation with Daniel and the longer process of figuring out what came next. I want to be honest about that conversation. It was not a single dramatic scene, but a series of them, stretched over several weeks. Daniel was in therapy. He'd started immediately. A man named Dr. Kaplan, who he'd apparently been referred to and was seeing twice a week. And the therapy was doing something to him that I could see, a kind of opening, an access to his own interior that the composed exterior had been blocking for years. He was not, as I might have expected, defensive in those conversations. He was sad and open and willing to look at things that I don't think he'd looked at before. He acknowledged the folder without minimizing it. He acknowledged the earrings, the dress colors, the Portugal trip. He said, with the difficulty of someone who is saying something true that he would prefer not to be true, I think I've been trying to bring her back for 12 years, and I think I chose you because you gave me the best chance. And I think I love you, I'm certain I love you, but I also think that love has been tangled up in that project in a way I didn't see. Did you select me consciously? I said. At that dinner party, did you look at me and think she resembles Vivian, she's what I want? He was quiet. I looked at you, he said, and I felt recognized, like I was looking at something I understood deeply. I didn't articulate it as she looks like Vivian, but in retrospect, yes, the recognition was that it was familiarity. And then over the years, I didn't consciously plan it, he said. I want to be clear about that. I don't believe I sat down and said, I will shape her into Vivian's image, but I had a very clear and strong preference for certain things, the way you looked, the things you were interested in, and I expressed those preferences consistently because they made me feel close to something I'd lost, and I didn't stop to ask whether you were choosing those things for yourself. Because you didn't think of it as your choices, I said. You thought of it as love. Yes. That's the most disturbing thing, I said, that there was no malice, that it was love genuinely, and the love did this anyway. He looked at me with his complicated eyes. Yes, he said. The wedding was cancelled. We agreed to that in the same conversation without much drama, because we were both clear by that point that November was not an option. I called Bryn, who was devastated in the professional sense, and I called my parents, who took it the way they took most things, with careful measured disappointment, and the underlying sense that they had hoped I would be happy without fully extending faith in this particular direction. My father said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I'm figuring out who I am." He said after a pause, "I always thought you were you," like it was simple, like the answer was obvious. I said, "Me too, Dad. It got complicated." Vivian and I had coffee one more time, about 2 months after the night I confronted Daniel. She and Marcus had been traveling and I'd waited until she was back, because there was no urgency and I wanted the conversation to happen in the right conditions, quietly, without hurry. She looked different than she had at the party. Less guarded or differently guarded, I was different too, less undone, more settled in the process I was in, and maybe that changed how I read her. She asked how things had gone. I told her the shortened version, the folder, the confrontation, the cancelled wedding, Daniel in therapy. She was quiet for a moment. "How are you?" she said, and it was the real version of the question, not the social one. "Better," I said. "Complicated but better." I paused. "I've been cutting back the areas where I lost ground, the things that were mine before him, trying to figure out which ones I genuinely want to keep and which ones I only kept because they were curated into me." "That's hard work," she said. "The music was easy," I said. "That came back quickly, it was just a matter of giving myself permission to play what I wanted. The aesthetic stuff is harder. The apartment. I've started changing things but I don't always know what the underneath preference is, what I would have chosen without his influence. Sometimes I choose something and I can't tell if I'm choosing it because I like it or because I'm reactively choosing the opposite of what he liked." "That's a real thing," she said. "I went through it. The reactive opposition is its own trap. You're still organizing around him, just in the negative direction." "Yes," I said. "Dr. Lowe says the same thing, just what do you actually want, not what he wanted, what do you want?" Vivian smiled, and it was the real smile, not the one from the party. "I'm still working on that one," she said. 12 years out, but it does get cleaner." I looked at her across the coffee cups, and I thought about how we might have been friends in different circumstances, how we were in some ways the same kind of woman, careful and intelligent, and prone to absorbing the preferences of people we loved, which was perhaps the quality that had attracted Daniel to both of us, the malleability that looked like openness and was also a vulnerability. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly. "For not, I should have said more at the party when I saw you. I saw it immediately. I knew what I was looking at. And I made that comment and then I let Daniel deflect and I'm sorry I didn't say more." "You said enough," I said. "You said exactly enough. I had to see the rest myself. If you told me all of it that night, I'd have defended him. I wasn't ready." "When are we ever ready?" she said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I got my hair cut. I'm telling you this as though it's a small thing, and I know it sounds like one but it wasn't. And this is the part that's hardest to explain to people who haven't been in the specific situation I was in. The hair felt enormous. The hair was the thing I'd been steered away from most consistently for 6 years, the thing he'd said he'd miss, the thing that had felt like the most physical expression of the me he'd wanted to maintain. I made an appointment at a salon I'd never been to, not the one Daniel had always recommended, which I'd been going to for 4 years. A different one, with no associations, no history, no accumulated significance. The stylist, Jade, asked what I wanted. I said, "I'm coming out of a long relationship where someone had very specific preferences about my hair. I want something that's mine." She looked at my hair for a moment. She tilted her head 45 degrees and I almost laughed at that, and then she said, "Are you open to suggestions or do you know what you want?" "Both," I said. "Give me a suggestion and I'll tell you if it's mine." She suggested something shorter with more movement, something that would show the natural wave I'd been suppressing for years. Not dramatic, she understood I wasn't here for drama, just truer to what was underneath the careful, straight style. "Yes," I said, "that's mine." 2 hours later, I walked out of the salon and my hair moved when I walked, and I caught my reflection in a shop window, and I stopped, and I looked at myself. I looked like myself. Not a refined version, not a curated version, not a sketch someone had made of who they wanted to love, just the actual person. 40 years old, hazel eyes, olive skin, and hair that had its wave back because I'd stopped suppressing it. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, and felt the weight of the last several months, and also the weight of the last 6 years, and also something underneath all of that which was older and more permanent, which was just me, Mackenzie. the woman who bought blue velvet couches and ate Indian food on Tuesdays, and walked in the wrong direction sometimes and found things she didn't know she was looking for. I moved into my own apartment in August, a new one, not a return to anywhere I'd been before. I furnished it slowly in the way you furnish something when you're paying attention, when you're asking yourself questions about every object. Do I want this, or is this what I think I should want? Is this mine? Some things from the old apartment were genuinely mine, I discovered. I wasn't starting from zero. There were books I wanted, recipes I'd developed myself, a painting I'd bought impulsively at a street fair in 2019 and had loved without qualification. There were habits, the way I sat cross-legged, the coffee preference, the window seats that were mine and had always been mine, and had survived the 6 years intact. There were also the recovered things, the music which I was rebuilding gradually, adding back the songs I'd loved and lost track of, the yellow dress which I wore again in August and which felt in August like a piece of evidence, not of loss but of persistence, of the fact that I had been there underneath the whole time, even when I couldn't find myself clearly. Cora helped me move.